Chapter 13. Contact. Earth Federation scouts had detected a change in Zeon activity. Krish's forces, the survivors of the Granada battle, and other support warships had previously been observed converging around Abawa-Ku, but now there were ships from entirely different units moving under full speed in the opposite direction, toward Solomon. General Revel and his top officers puzzled over the new information. "Sir, it looks like Vice Admiral Dozel Zabi's mobile attack unit is trying to link up with the Zeon reserves on Solomon and stage an attack on LH. What should we do, sir? We don't have enough ships to divert some to another position." "Are you absolutely certain Dozel's headed for Solomon?" "Yes, sir. And if he links up with the other ships there, they'll form a fleet that could easily take on LH. That means the Abawa-Ku forces will also probably come out in a feint maneuver and try to take LH in a pincer attack. We've got to be able to support LH somehow. We've got 3 divisions on Luna 2 that could help." "Yes, sir." "It's a tough call. We don't have any solid proof Dozel will attack LH, but on the other hand, the Zeon forces are as much in the dark about our plans as we are about theirs. This is where Zabi family rivalries get interesting. It looks like the Zeon High Command has equally divided their forces between Dozel and Cecilia Zabi, so neither loses face." General Revel made light of the situation, but he was troubled by the lack of information on the true extent of the Zeon forces converging on LH. The whole business was distracting him from his own plans. The 20-square-meter 3D display, projected on the ceiling above him, showed the estimated positions of both enemy and friendly forces in red and green flashing lights and did a particularly good job of representing the moon. He looked up at it and muttered, "Where's the focus of Zeon's military strength now? That's what I need to know. Where's their new type unit?" He was convinced Zeon had not yet totally committed its new type unit, and he was certain it was not the centerpiece of their current strategy. He even suspected that much of the talk of Zeon new types was simply rumor, perhaps intentionally planted by spies. "Abawa-Ku," he whispered to himself. And we know that several ships from Side 6 have recently docked there." He was even more worried by information he had received about Zeon's Mahar colony. A flurry of activity had apparently taken place there, perhaps in relation to an evacuation of the entire cylinder. "Any evidence an evacuation has been completed?" he asked. No one knew yet. After spending the night with Amuro, the first thing Sayla said was, "If you're a real new type, Amuro, it's a dream come true for me. Maybe you wish I'd never said what I did about my brother earlier, but it's too late. I said it, and I can't help it if you hate me for it." Still sitting on the bed with his back to her, he replied, "I just don't understand it. I don't have a brother. But I don't think it's the sort of thing anyone should ever say." "Maybe so," she said, suddenly gloomy. Amuro turned around and looked at her. She had just finished fastening her brassiere. How beautiful she is, he thought. As if sensing him, she smiled faintly. He stood up, hugged her, kissed the nape of her neck, and drank deeply of her scent. There was always something vague and unsettling between men and women, and surely that was the problem between him and Sayla. Her earlier statement had been so outrageous, he decided that it must have stemmed from a twisted desire to save her brother. That was the only way he could possibly interpret it. And as for her remark about his being a new type, well, he couldn't really understand the connection. She probably just needed a man to help her forget the whole unpleasantness with her brother, and any man who could keep her attention would do. Amuro was not even sure if he filled the bill on that score. The more his new type potential developed, the more prone to self-delusion he seemed to be becoming. Sayla sighed deeply and embraced him. He held her tightly around the waist and noted how slender and delicate she seemed. He wished he were more experienced, more of a man, and knew better what to do. She groaned, and he realized he had squeezed her too hard. "Sorry," he apologized, cursing his clumsiness. "Enemy forces at 186 degrees, 10 minutes. Elevation 33 degrees, 26 minutes. Stage 1 alert." Speakers blared throughout the Federation's LH moon base, letting the defenders know that Zeon's ships would enter missile and beam cannon range within 10 minutes. Amuro and his fellow pilots had just returned from a second training mission when the next announcement came: open launch deck doors. All crew don normal suits. The Pegasus's deck hatch doors opened. Amuro hooked a lift grip and sped along at maximum speed through a passageway leading directly to the deck, and then used his inertia to leap up to the new Gundam model mobile suit. The moon had gravity, but it was easy to jump 4 or 5 meters. He knew the Pegasus was already moving, because through its open front hatch he could see the walls of the LH moon port slide downward. From inside the Gundam cockpit, he yelled into his microphone, "This is G3. Ensign Amuro Ray, ready for launch." The communications monitor above his main display flickered to life, and Sayla's voice emerged from its speaker. "Pegasus exiting port area in 20 seconds. Launch after confirming clearance." "Roger. G3 now launching." "Amuro?" Sayla was so surprised that she unintentionally violated takeoff protocol by calling out informally. There was a strict rule against launching mobile suits before the Pegasus completely cleared the port area, and it looked like Amuro was about to break it. Through the open launch hatch in front of the Gundam, Amuro watched the walls of port slip by faster and faster. He waited for the right instant and then yelled, "Enemy approaching, G3 now launching." He fired the main engine under none, and it responded with a roar that reverberated through his spine. G3, Ensign Amuro launching. He heard Sayla confirm his launch and relay the information to Bright. In the background, he thought he heard the skipper say something negative, but he was not about to dwell on it. He stepped down on the middle launch pedal and felt a mild G-force as all 16 meters of the giant Gundam mobile suit surged forward on the launch catapult. The instant it kicked off the catapult, he fired the backpack verniers and put them on full thrust, and the suit began a slow climb, squeezing through the 80-meter gap between the Pegasus and the inside walls of the moon base. In seconds, he had checked his ceiling display and confirmed that he had the correct attitude and trajectory to clear the port. Then he checked his beam rifle and the arm that held it for full range of movement, and checked the integrity of the energy circuits. Then he released the safety on his weapon systems. When he next glanced at his main monitor, he had safely cleared the moon surface. "Godspeed, Ensign Amuro." Sayla's voice came through, but when Amuro turned to look at the mini-monitor where her face normally appeared, Minovsky interference had already broken up her image. Her next words were unintelligible, but he didn't have time to listen anyway. The static was so distracting that he turned it off. From that point on, he had to locate the enemy with the naked eye. He switched the cockpit's 8 observation displays to maximum telescopic mode for a 360-degree panorama. To his horror, what looked like an enemy mobile suit was rapidly descending behind him toward the moon surface. Even worse, the LH base had not yet fired a single cannon or missile in defense. One cardinal rule of military strategy was that once a lone mobile suit broke through a defensive perimeter, it was almost impossible to stop. But none of the Federation forces seemed to have even noticed. He spun the Gundam around and gave chase at high speed. The GS pushed him back into his seat, and the thrill of an impending fight made his spine tingle. He eased off on the left and right levers and told himself to slow down. Be careful. The enemy suit swung into view directly in front of him, and it was definitely a Zaku, but faster than any he had seen before. To his dismay, it was still plunging unchallenged straight toward a corner of the LH. Worse yet, he realized it might only be a decoy. The enemy sometimes deployed Zakus at that stage of attack, but they rarely sent out only one. There was not a second to be wasted. He fired a single blast from his beam rifle. The enemy suit was too far away for a direct hit, but the beam would help alert the Federation defenders. As he expected, the suit returned his fire, but he ignored it. He twisted his mobile suit 90 degrees and checked the heavens unfolding above him. Amid the static from Minovsky interference, he could overhear panic in the communications transmissions from LH. The people down on the base had never in their wildest dreams imagined such a sudden attack, even from a scout unit. The 2 gun cannons from the Pegasus finally caught up with him, but he couldn't help grumbling when he noticed that the new GM pilots, Ensign Sarkis and Kriya, were late. In mobile suit battles, machines normally advanced in formation until the enemy was directly engaged. From then on, it was essentially every man for himself. There were, of course, some basic tactics employed, most of which were based on conventional dogfighting experience, but there were no hard and fast rules. Mobile suit combat was a relatively new type of warfare with no real military model to follow, and it tended to quickly devolve into close-quarter combat. Amuro slowed down when he finally saw the Pegasus pulling along his port side. He wanted at all costs to avoid being separated from his own forces and accidentally destroying a friendly ship. As he watched, a Salamis-class cruiser rose up on either side, and the lead one moved straight forward. Its goal was clear: to protect the heart of the LH moon base. "Don't overexpose yourself," he yelled at the lead cruiser over his mic, but it was too late. He sensed a light ahead of them, coming faster and faster, almost leaping out toward him. It was a light he had experienced before, when fighting the Red Comet, and when fighting Lala Sun in her mobile armor. It was a thin, glowing beam of light traveling at great speed. And then he saw the flares of 5 or 6 rocket engines spinning, coming closer and closer. "Damn! I've seen this before. I know what this is." He swore under his breath, leveled his beam rifle in front of him, and fired. He knew the blast was wasted. It scorched through the blackness of space, but the things he was aiming at were far too fast. They leapt out of the way and continued to plunge toward the lead Salamis-class cruiser. The next blast from his beam rifle finally struck home. One of the attacking objects burst into a ball of white light in the blackness. But only then did the lead Salamis-class cruiser seem to realize it was the target of the attack and commence defensive fire. The rocket-propelled objects evaded the barrage and made a beeline toward the ship. One of the easiest ways to overwhelm a defense is with numbers. Amuro picked off another of the objects, but that was as much as he could do. Several missiles plunged into the cruiser's bridge, and after a few paralyzing seconds of nothingness, it was enveloped in flames. Then the flames mushroomed into a ball of white light that illuminated the surface of the moon below. Amuro knew he was confronting the same weapon Lala Sun had used, the Elmeth and its bits. The weaving engine flares were from the multiple supporting units, armed with either a beam cannon or nuclear warheads and controlled from the Elmeth, despite the heavy Minovsky concentrations. Amuro knew from prior experience that the bits were not radio-controlled, that somehow Lala Sun, the pilot, had been able to control them with her brainwaves. What he and the Earth Federation forces did not yet know was that the system depended on a new interface device called a Psychomu, which had magnified and projected her will. Another Lala Sun. Amuro remembered what Lieutenant List Hayashida had said about Zeon's plans for a new type unit. The Flanagan Agency had clearly been more successful than the Earth Federation had ever suspected. They can't possibly have very many of these things, though. He tried to reassure himself, straining to see better in the area of space where the flares had appeared. Unlike the time he had encountered Lala, he still could not feel anything from the pilot of the main component in the system. After pondering for a second, he decided it must be because of the distance involved. There was one other possibility, but it was too terrifying to consider. Kai, Hayato, and the 2 GM pilots deployed their suits in a horizontal formation on either side of Pegasus II, and Amuro yelled into his mic as loudly as possible at the 2 gun cannons. "We're under attack by enemy new types. Make sure GM 324 and 325 stay to our rear." Almost immediately, he heard Kai parrot his words in shock. Enemy new types? There was no time to reply. Amuro had already spotted Zeon's suits above and to his right, 6 of them, and all a model he had never seen before, deployed in what he recognized as a spear formation. There was no sign of the Elmeth bit system. Before he could get a good look at them, they plunged forward, attacking a squad of Salamis-class cruisers to the Pegasus's starboard that were riding cover over the Federation's 3rd White Base-class ship, the Thoroughbred. 6 Federation GMs came soaring up in the Thoroughbred's defense, but it was obvious that their pilots were green and outclassed. Worse yet, Amuro could tell that the new model Zeon suits were even faster than Zaku's. "Kai, Hayato," he yelled. "Don't leave the Pegasus unprotected." He spun his Gundam to the right and put it into a dive. There was no way to save the cruisers, and at that point he wasn't even certain he could help the thoroughbred, but he had to try. His gray suit streaked through the black space above the moon as he desperately attempted to cut off the enemy. The new model Zeon suits had flared waists that gave them a less threatening skirted appearance, but Amuro knew it was an illusion. The new design probably hid the nozzles of new, more powerful rocket engines, which in turn accounted for the increased speed over the old Zaku's. When he saw a ball of white light flare in space again, he knew one of the enemy's suits had already scored a direct hit on a Salamis-class cruiser. "You'll pay for that," he yelled while lining up the sights on his beam rifle with the crosshairs on his main monitor. For an instant, the lead Zeon suit seemed to waver. "Sensed me, eh?" he said, surprised. In a fraction of a second, he shifted his aim to the next suit in line and pulled the trigger. A narrow band of light streaked out of his gun barrel and struck the enemy's suit, which was still illuminated by the earlier Salamis' explosion. Yet another equally large ball of light mushroomed in the same area, and the enemy formation shifted to a course that took them below it, out of Amuro's view. As he watched, the thoroughbred emerged shuddering from the light, dropping in altitude toward the surface of the moon. "You're reacting too slow," he yelled at the Federation ship. The thoroughbred had almost met the same fate the cruiser had earlier. At the rate things were going, the enemy suits would continue their hit-and-run tactics, swoop close to the surface of the moon, dodge LH's air defenses, and then disengage. And in the interim, they would destroy a couple more Federation ships. Amuro nonetheless chose not to pursue the formation. He was more worried about the Elmeth he had encountered earlier. It was a far more formidable rival. He turned the Gundam around and positioned himself under the left wing of the Pegasus. Kai, in his C-108 gun cannon, initiated skin talk with him. "I can't see any enemy above us, Amuro," Kai said. "What's going on? You're supposed to be the new type around here. Go easy on me, pal." "Ooh!" Amuro suddenly exclaimed. He felt a ricochet-like sound. It was distinct but not physical, and neither discernibly high nor low in tone. It seemed to reverberate not in his ears but directly on his brainstem. And he wasn't the only one to sense it. Kai, Hayato, and all the others in the area apparently did too. Then it happened again. It was powerful enough to make all who heard it tremble in fear. Sayla was manning the communications panel on the Pegasus bridge when she first heard it, fearing her headset was somehow preventing her from telling where the sound was coming from. She tore it off her head and stared around the room as if looking for the source. Bright, in the captain's seat, turned around and gaped at her. "Was that caused by a failure in the communications system?" he asked. "I can't tell, Skipper." Mirai, manning the helm, turned to Sayla and exclaimed, "I heard it too then." Both hands simultaneously arrived at the same conclusion. "It's coming from outside the ship," they announced. "Outside?" Bright, following their gaze, stared through the bridge window at the space in front of them. All he could see was the usual, millions of stars staring back at him. Then he noticed the two GM mobile suits attached to Pegasus II. They had moved 2,000 meters out in front of the ship, apparently anticipating trouble. Sayla couldn't sit in front of the communications panel any longer. She stood up, kicked away her chair, and ran over to the bridge window. Because the sound she heard seemed to trail off in a specific direction, she looked upward. "Ensign Mirai," she exclaimed. "There's a light." She knew none of the others would be able to see it. She wasn't even 100% sure she hadn't imagined it herself. "What are you talking about?" Bright demanded. "Mirai, it's coming at us, at about 1 o'clock. In response, Mirai immediately spun the helm, and in so doing violated a basic rule of the ship. Bright was technically only a junior-grade lieutenant, but he was still captain of the ship, and he was the one who was supposed to issue orders. Mirai had acted unilaterally. But that same instant Bright saw the Gundam and gun cannon swoop into view, firing their beam rifles, and and 28-centimeter shoulder cannons. And then he saw the light of 3 explosions mushroom in the area Sayla had pointed to earlier. The filter on the shell-proofed glass of the bridge windows automatically activated, and in the reduced light he finally spotted something else, what looked like 6 homing missiles streaking toward the Pegasus. "So, that's what they were talking about," he exclaimed. "Hard to starboard," he yelled. "Give me a curtain of defensive fire." He knew there was no time to execute his orders properly, but luckily sniping blasts from the Gundam's beam rifle took out 3 of the objects bearing down on them. The bridge rocked from the closest explosions, and then special protective barriers were activated on all ship windows. With the main bridge window view blocked, Bright concentrated his gaze on a large horizontally elongated rhomboid-shaped monitor above it, which now displayed the same view. On it he saw the immediate light from the blasts diffuse and residual particles flash and fade. "Think they were homing missiles?" he asked Sayla. They had seemed to cut an arc through space. "I don't know, sir," she replied, "but I don't think so." Before the window barriers had completely retracted, she began to scan the heavens in front of the ship visually. Have thrown the book at her for acting on her own, but he seemed to be taking it all in stride. Things were happening beyond his immediate comprehension, but he was nonetheless capable of deducing the proper response. He was either a man with enormous leadership potential, she thought, or perhaps even someone with new-type potential. General Revel had overcome considerable opposition in the civilian and military hierarchy to appoint Bright skipper of the Pegasus II, but Bright's performance now, Sayla concluded, more than justified the effort. 12 small monitors on her communications panel were dedicated to mobile suits in the area. As she relayed Bright's orders to the 4 suits still hugging close to the Pegasus, she kept an eye on the one that normally showed Amuro. He was so far away that it was filled with static, but sometimes for a few fleeting seconds she could distinguish his form in the darkened Gundam cockpit. She knew she was probably the last thing on his mind right now, but that was the way men were in combat. She was thinking about him not because she had more time on her hands than he did, but because of a strange tension she felt. His image on her screen was always the same size, but he was physically rapidly distancing himself from her. She could feel the increased separation. Was she being oversensitive? She didn't think so. It was simply that every once in a while she couldn't help thinking of him hurtling through space, hunting for the thing that had targeted them. What was it? She recalled the mysterious sensation she had felt earlier, first an indescribable tone that had pierced her brow, then a glowing streak she could see deep in her mind. The line of light it had formed still lingered, and she felt she could almost trace it back to its source in space, and she knew that was where Amuro was headed. He was plunging into the unknown, doing something terribly dangerous, but terribly important. The more she thought about it, the more she admired him. He had the same mysterious inner strength she had observed earlier in her captain. Bright interrupted her thought with a command. "Sayla, tell everyone manning laser sensors to ignore the others for the moment and concentrate on Amuro." "Yes, sir," she replied. Bright clearly seemed to know what was going on. Straight ahead, he answered without hesitating. "A real new type. Mirai, Sayla, you both saw something earlier, didn't you?" Sayla felt she had finally become a true member of the Pegasus 2 core crew, and despite everything else that was going on, she felt happy. As with many regions near Earth, the area surrounding the moon was contaminated with debris from the ravages of war. Chunks of landfill and sections of former colony structures, objects often over 100 meters in diameter, floated incongruously, randomly, in orbit. Amuro Ray skillfully made his Gundam leap over one such obstacle, and then finally spotted what he was looking for, the same machine Lala's son had once piloted, an Elmeth. He swore under his breath, trying not to think how many more of the things he might soon confront, and then saw something streak toward him. But it was not the flare of a rocket. The Elmeth had fired its beam cannon at him. Without bothering to line up his sights, he squeezed the trigger, and several bands of light from his beam rifle converged on the enemy machine. But it leapt effortlessly out of the way. He had no time to try to establish any empathic communication with the pilot. The waves of thought he felt streaming toward him were too unidirectional, too powerful, too insistent, and too unyielding. Concentrating, he squeezed the trigger again, hoping for a single knockout blow. He had already learned enough about the Elmeth's performance from seeing its reaction to his first blast to know that he had to act fast or it would kill him. To his dismay, it evaded his second attack too, and his third. The enemy pilot appeared to possess a mysterious latent power. 2 more beams streaked out from the Elmeth toward him. Thanks to the Gundam's new magnetic coating, he was able to evade them, but he knew he was being outmaneuvered. A new, unfamiliar anger suddenly welled up inside him. He raged against the faceless Elmeth pilot for cooperating with Zeon. It was because of such cooperation that military men on both sides were starting to consider new types instruments of war. He wanted to scream. New types aren't weapons, they're humans. You're supposed to be like Lala's son, capable of a new communion of thought. The more emotional Amuro became, the faster he wanted to move, and the more he wanted to close in on the Elmeth and destroy it. He slipped by some more space debris, slid sharply to the right, and there it was again. With his left monitor clearly showing the rear of the enemy machine, he kept it in his line of fire, and the instant it seemed to notice him, he pulled the trigger. First he thought he had scored a direct hit, but after the initial whoosh of light, he realized with disappointment that the Elmeth had only been grazed and probably had received only minor damage. It seemed to stagger in the light, but then proceeded to hide itself in the remains of a destroyed colony. Amuro knew it was time to abandon his pursuit. A heavy, oppressive sensation began to form in his subconscious, quickly transforming itself into physical fear. Something was coming at him from behind. It was he. He was coming. There was no mistaking it. It was Char, the Red Comet. Sure enough, he glanced up at his left rearview monitor and saw readouts in both corners indicating relative distance and estimated point of contact with an approaching object. But this was not a video game simulation. He needed more than numbers. He needed visual confirmation. He spun the Gundam around 180 degrees and spotted the enemy's suit. But Char was not piloting the Red Zaku he had expected. His new model mobile suit had a flared skirt-like construction where its legs would have been and was painted a dark color to blend in with the blackness of space. Its mono-eye flashed as it plunged straight toward him. Amuro swore softly. "Don't underestimate me, Char." He adjusted his sights and felt a renewed sense of oppression. His opponent was angry, and, he realized with some surprise, probably as desperate as he was himself. But Amuro didn't realize that his own emotions were being triggered by a type of empathy, that he was already unconsciously adapting to his enemy's mood, and that if he weren't careful, the empathy itself could cause his destruction. The skirted Zeon suit proceeded in a straight line, and then, as if sensing Amuro's weakness, suddenly fired its beam rifle. A cluster of beams streaked toward Amuro, but he had already shifted his own suit to the right and positioned his shield in front of him with its right arm. The next nanosecond the main beam creased him, and the glowing particles on its periphery blasted thousands of invisible holes in the shield. The Gundam body shuddered, its mechanical components strained to the limit. Even in his new Rick-Dom mobile suit, Char still relied on his old hit-and-run tactics. Seconds later, he slipped by the Gundam's left side and fired, but Amuro fired at exactly the same instant. Incredibly, the particle beams from their respective rifles collided head-on, and a ball of white light equal to that of an exploding warship mushroomed in space and then faded. "He's faster than I thought," Char swore. He knew that if the Gundam had been caught in the middle of the light, all the armor in the world would not have saved it. He had visually sighted and attacked the enemy suit, but it had demonstrated astounding speed and agility in its evasive action and counterattack. For a second he wondered if the Gundam before him was really the same one he had encountered in battle before. Its fuselage was no longer white but had a light gray look that made it seem more formidable than before. He grinned, despite himself, at the psychological effect a mere color change could create. And the pilot? He considered the notion that it might be the same young kid he had faced before on Texas, but quickly abandoned the idea. There was no way of precisely knowing the final outcome of the Gundam showdown with Lala's Elmeth on Texas, but there was also no way, he told himself, that its pilot could possibly have escaped the subsequent explosion of the colony cylinder. He himself had escaped only by the skin of his teeth, and at that point he had already intuitively known that Lala's son was dead. He recalled the whole affair with particular bitterness, for during her last moments he knew she had had someone other than him in her heart. And her death had made the idea that the enemy mobile suit and its pilot might have survived almost too cruel to contemplate, for it would mean she had fought and died in vain. Except for the pilot of the original white mobile suit, he had received no intelligence information on the existence of any other Federation new types. He desperately wished he knew exactly what had happened. In the meantime, he shielded his Rick-Dom behind some floating debris and checked for any movement to his rear. "Where's Chalia Bull?" he muttered. He trusted the lieutenant and was convinced he was the real thing. In terms of the man's ability to fly in formation and the way he had evaded the Federation beam blast earlier, it was entirely possible that he possessed even greater skills than he, Char, the seasoned combat veteran, did. Just as he feared, less than 40 kilometers to his rear, he saw several streaks of light in the blackness. He put his Rick-Dom into a jump and sprang from his cover. To his astonishment, he nearly collided with the Gundam, whose pilot was just as taken aback as he was. It all happened so fast that as the two suits slipped by each other, neither pilot had time to properly aim his beam rifle or bazooka. Char swore and fired even though he knew it was useless, and the Gundam pilot did the same. But then something different happened to the Gundam. As Char watched, beams fired by Chalia Bull rained down on the Gundam from above and to the left, but when he turned back to look at the Federation suit, it had already evaded them by slipping sideways and taking cover behind 100-meter-long rock. The rock caught a beam blast and exploded in fragments, but that did not help Char, for in the explosion the enemy suit suddenly vanished from his view. He swore again. Where in hell is Cusco Al on her Elmeth? She had always seemed overconfident. He had no way of knowing she had been hit by the Gundam earlier. Amuro Ray was getting nervous. There were two skirted Zeon suits after him, and something made him suspect that both of their pilots were new types. He had to make sure they didn't get near Kai and Hayato, and if at all possible, destroy them before his comrades entered the combat zone. He knew things weren't going in his favor. He turned away from the moon, scanned his observation displays, and saw two more mushrooming balls of white light from exploding Federation ships in the area. It seemed incredible that only 4 or 5 enemy suits could wreak so much damage. He knew what he had to do and knew that only he could do it. His ego was egging him on, but he also knew he would need every ounce of confidence he could find simply to confront the pilots in Zeon's new type unit. Keeping one eye on Char's skirted suit below him, he turned and saw the suits that had rained beams on him a second earlier. To his horror, instead of 2, there were now 3. Where had he miscalculated? He pulled the trigger, and the muzzle of his beam rifle flared, but the result was unexpected. He had aimed at the lead suit, but it had executed a perfect evasion maneuver, and his beam had scored a direct hit on the second suit in line instead. His elation with a hit was quickly tempered with fear. Why, he nearly screamed aloud. Had the lead suit been able to avoid him? Who the hell was piloting it? It certainly was no ordinary person, and it might be an opponent even more formidable than Char Aznable. He fired 2 more bursts of beams. Incredibly, the lead suit evaded him again. What on earth was its faceless pilot trying to do? He wanted to scream, "Stop!" He wanted desperately to tell him true new types wouldn't lend their powers to an enemy as detestable as the Zabi family. He was furious. As his Gundam streaked through the void, he saw fire below him from Kai and Hayato's gun cannons converge on the skirted Zeon suits. It was ineffective, and he knew it would only make things worse. Sure enough, both the Federation fleet guns and the ground-based defenses below suddenly concentrated a furious barrage of fire right on the area he was in. He yelled, "Hey, don't forget I'm here," but knew he probably would have done the same thing in their position. Within the space of a dozen minutes, nearly 10 Federation ships had been incinerated. The junior officers manning the moon-based missiles and the ship's guns were almost duty-bound to fire if they so much as thought they saw the enemy. In the midst of the barrage, he strained to keep an eye on the Rickdoms and hoped he wouldn't be hit. Char finally gave the order to retreat. His men had done enough fighting for the day. They had obtained valuable data on the performance of the Elmeth and new Rickdom machines in combat, and both Cusco Al and Chalia Bull had managed to get in a little on the job training. To stay longer in an area so clearly controlled by the enemy would be tantamount to suicide. He pulled out of the area, and the surviving Zeon suits followed him, trailed by withering fire from the Earth Federation forces that illuminated the blackness. With the attack on the Federation's LH moon base finally over, the Pegasus II returned to port, where, to the crew's surprise, they found they had all been promoted an entire rank. General Revel, acting on his own conviction, had decided a promotion was necessary for them to function as an official new type corps, and the general's staff at Jaburo on Earth, realizing that he was staking his career and life on the new strategy, had decided to humor him. They had apparently even considered advancing the crew 2 ranks in the hierarchy, but Revel had balked. "If we don't promote them," the brass reportedly had said, "their ranks will be out of sync with those of the crews on other warships. How can Bright Noah function as skipper if he's only a lieutenant?" "They're all too young," Revel had replied. "It'd go to their heads. They know what they're in for, and I need them to think clearly." At around 11 o'clock mean time, Bright returned to the Pegasus from a war council on the base. Although none of the core crew members had been ordered to do so, they had gathered in the armory almost as if on cue and were waiting for him. Bright, now a full lieutenant, turned to Amuro and joked, "If it gets too hard for us to synchronize our activities with you, mister, we might have to put you in charge of tactical operations, eh?" "Only if I have the appropriate qualifications and talents, sir." Amuro grinned back. He himself had been promoted to junior-grade lieutenant, as had Kaishiden, Hayato Kobayashi, and Mirai Yashima. Slegger Rowe, the gunnery specialist and already a junior-grade lieutenant, griped, "Am I the only one who didn't get promoted just because I joined later than the rest of you?" "It's all a fluke, Slegger," Bright answered as if consoling him. "They only did this to make my job easier as skipper of the ship." Then, turning to Selah, he said, "And you're a petty officer first class now, so have a seat along with the rest and listen to what I'm about to say." The general was extremely interested in learning more about the enemy's raid on LH today, but I couldn't fill him in on the details at the meeting because so many others were in attendance. One thing's clear, though. The Gundam moved out too fast. Bright sipped on a cup of coffee when he said this and then glanced at Amuro. "It's too bad we can't depend on radio transmissions," he continued, referring back to his earlier comment. "Because then we on the ship actually could have received directions from Amuro, riding point out there in his Gundam." Slegger leaned his body forward and practically thrust his large chin in Selah's face. She made as if to move away, but he ignored her. "Well, Selah," he said, "tell me, how'd you know the enemy was approaching?" "Gee," she replied, "I didn't really see them. It was sort of like there was a flare of reddish light inside my head." Turning to Mirai, she asked, "Isn't that the way it seemed to you too?" Mirai had taken her boots off and was relaxing in an almost disheveled pose on a sofa in the room. "It sure did," she said. "It was almost like seeing them, though. But that was just this one time. It's not always like that. Maybe the enemy wanted to make sure we spotted them today." Kai glanced at Hayato and commented, "Beats me whatever these fair damsels are talking about. I bet it's sort of like the sparks you see when someone slugs you," his comrade replied. Then Kai turned toward Amuro and said, "It's a sort of a white light, isn't it?" Amuro loosened the collar of his uniform and said, "Maybe you guys were slugged by Lieutenant Rao one too many times during training." Then he felt Selah's gaze on him and fell silent. Knew Selah had been out the night before, but Amuro was the last person she would have imagined her with. Reflecting on it, though, she realized it was possible. Amuro had once had a crush on Selah, yet something in the way the two were acting with each other now suggested a much deeper bond. Was it, she wondered, some sort of new type psychic affinity? "I agree with Mirai," Amuro said. I think the enemy deliberately wanted us to see the light. I felt some sort of weird psychic pressure directed at me, something telling me it was coming. We know the pilot of the Elmeth on Texas was a new type, right? But there was something different about today. He was not being exactly honest. He had no intention of telling anyone, even Selah, exactly how different Lala-san had been. What do you mean? Slegger asked. By psychic pressure. It was a menacing sensation, Amuro answered, and it was projected right through the mobile armor fuselage, the sort of thing you might feel if a sworn enemy was standing right in front of. Menacing, eh? Slegger said with an awed look. You. Damn, Kai interjected, sounding almost jealous. I never felt anything that specific. See, Slegger said, turning to Hayato. Even if we had 9 lives, we still wouldn't stand a chance against an enemy like that. I'll say, Hayato agreed. You know what bothers me, Bright said, is that if anyone told this story to the other pilots in the Force, they'd quit the next day. The skipper was right, Amuro realized. It was the reason new types weren't officially recognized in the Federation forces yet, and the reason their deployment in combat was still top secret. You know what I think? He said. If new types are really all they're cracked up to be, there ought to be a way to use them not just to wage war but to stop it. You must be out of your mind, Bright said. It's hopeless as long as Zeon is under the thumb of the Zavi family. Besides, Amuro, Kai added, look at the Federation. The war will never stop as long as the government brass, the Earth faction, or natives, or whatever they call them, insist on controlling the space colonies from their home planet. That was more than Bright could let pass. He stood up and spoke slowly, caustically. Mr. Kai Shiden, we don't allow talk like that around here, and it doesn't seem befitting of a Federation officer involved in a holy crusade to defend our sacred Mother Earth. The skipper's right, Kai, Slegger added with a grin. You'd better be careful, because for all you know I could be a spy sent by the Jaburo bureaucrats and I might squeal on you. There was something plausible about the way Slegger said it, if for no other reason than the fact that there were murky aspects to his resume. He had been bounced from unit to unit for bad conduct, but he was still stationed on the front lines of the war. And none of the core crew on the Pegasus II thought much of him either. He had a reputation for being a womanizer and an officer incapable of controlling his troops, who were as undisciplined as he was. Who gives a damn? Kai retorted. The skirted suits we let get away today are totally different from the old Zakas we're used to. And what about the new mobile armor we encountered that Amuro says sank one of our cruisers? Frankly, I don't care if you rat on me or not, Slegger. I stand a lot better odds than you do of buying the farm out there in space. Slegger stopped leaning over Selah and stared at the floor for a second. It was clear that Kai had spoken for almost all the other core crew members. Everyone felt a new sense of danger. Tell me, Amuro, Slegger asked softly, what are those units that accompany the main mobile armor? Us on the ship and you guys out in the suits, doesn't it? Kai grinned, turned to Bright and asked, You got anything for us to drink, Skipper? Some new type candidate you are, Bright retorted. Find it yourself, and while you're at it, think of this as your last night on the moon. If we embark tomorrow on a new mission, we're headed straight for Zeon. Amuro looked at Selah when he heard Bright's words, but she avoided his glance and started walking away. It made him feel uneasy. He started to follow her, but as he passed Slegger, the gunnery officer slapped him on the rear end and chortled. Way to go, playboy! I do something wrong, sir? Amuro bantered. Nope, not a bit. Be my guest, Slegger replied, grinning. It was a momentary interchange, but enough to make everyone in the armory burst out laughing. When Selah, almost out the door, turned around and realized what was going on, even she blushed. Bright, in an admonishing tone, said, Mr. Slegger-Rowe, mind your manners, please. You'll be a bad influence on the lad. Sorry, sir, Slegger said. Since everyone had filed out of the room except himself, Bright, and Mirai, he turned to her and brazenly inquired, Well, in that case, what about you, mademoiselle? Free tonight? Unfortunately for you, sir, she answered curtly. The answer is an emphatic no, Bright, ignoring the dialogue between the two, called up to the ship's bridge on the communications monitor. This is the skipper. I'm going to be down here in the armory another 30 minutes or so. Slegger glanced quizzically at his superior and shrugged his shoulders. Then he finally stood up and left Bright and Mirai alone in the room, seated together on the sofa. "Can you get some rest?" Mirai asked Bright. "Yeah, I'm off duty at 1 o'clock, he answered. She made no attempt to leave. He looked at her and said nothing. He knew it might be their last chance to relax together like this. "Is there something you wanted to tell me, Skipper?" She asked. "No, I just wanted the chance to look at you a little. You don't mind, do you?" "No, but it makes me feel a little embarrassed." "You want to talk?" "Not particularly. I'm a little worried about our mission, but there's nothing unusual about that. I just hope everything goes the way it's supposed to. I really appreciated the way the crew all gathered together here earlier. Something about it made me feel a little calmer. Everybody's used to the way things work around here now." Bright toyed with the idea of asking Mirai to sleep with him but never brought it up. It wouldn't seem right in their present situation, and the last thing he wanted to do was complicate things before they went into combat. Mirai clearly felt the same. A feeling of peace came over them. For several minutes they said nothing and merely enjoyed each other's presence. Mirai hinted only once at the potential for intimacy. "Maybe when the campaign's over," she said. "We should put some pictures on the wall in this room. I'll buy some for you." "A good idea," he replied. "It does look a little barren in here." Sayla and Muro also found they needed few words. They embraced in silence, their young bodies craving each other, but Sayla had a deep, unspoken regret, and Amuro knew what it was, the remark she had made earlier about killing her brother. But he didn't mention it, and neither did she. In the silence of their embrace, they fully accepted and understood each other's differences, and not just because they were new types. Amuro stopped thinking about his childhood sweetheart, Fra Bo, and he realized that sometimes the hunches he experienced were wrong, and for some reason that made him feel good.